U.S. seizes Venezuelan-linked tanker as Brazil warns of a humanitarian spiral. Why did the United States suddenly start stopping oil tankers near Venezuela? And what exactly is the real constraint here, law, logistics, or the risk of a naval incident? On December 20th, U.S. forces intercepted an oil tanker in international waters off Venezuela, the second such action in recent weeks. The ship was believed to be the Panama-flagged Centuries. Venezuela denounced the move as piracy. In Brazil, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva warned that any armed intervention would trigger a humanitarian catastrophe. This is not just a sanctions story. It is a contest over control of sea lanes, legal authority on the high seas, and how far pressure can go before it creates blowback in prices, migration, and regional security. The story turns on whether interdictions can be sustained without provoking escalation. Key points. The United States intercepted an oil tanker off Venezuela on December 20th in international waters, with U.S. officials framing it as sanctions enforcement tied to illicit oil flows. The vessel was believed to be the Panama-flagged Centuries, carrying roughly 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan Miri crude bound for China via an intermediary buyer. Venezuela condemned the interception as piracy and said it would raise the issue with international bodies. Brazil's president warned that armed intervention in Venezuela would produce a humanitarian catastrophe, urging restraint as tensions rise. The immediate economic lever is Venezuela's oil revenue, but the wider risk is a maritime confrontation if escorts, misreads, or stop-and-board operations multiply. Confirmed, a second interdiction took place on December 20th. Disputed, the U.S. description of the cargo as stolen and the legitimacy of stopping a vessel not publicly listed as sanctioned. Unknown, the precise legal pathway used for this boarding and what happens next to the crew and cargo. Background. Venezuela's economy leans heavily on oil exports. U.S. energy sanctions have been in place for years, pushing sales into discounted channels and encouraging workarounds like ship-to-ship transfers, identity changes in paperwork, and location masking. In early December, U.S. forces seized a different tanker tied to sanctioned oil flows, signaling a sharper approach, not only financial penalties, but physical disruption of shipments at sea. On December 16th, President Donald Trump announced a blockade aimed at sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuela. Days later, the December 20 interception followed, and this time, the ship in question was reported to be outside the published U.S. sanctions list. Analysis. Political and geopolitical dimensions. Washington's stated aim is to cut off revenue streams it links to criminal networks and to increase pressure on Nicolas Maduro's government. Interdiction is a louder tool than paperwork. It changes the cost-benefit calculation for shippers, insurers, and intermediaries immediately. Caracas wants the opposite outcome. Keep exports moving, avoid a perception of vulnerability, and prevent a precedent where outside forces can halt Venezuelan-linked trade near its coast. Public condemnation also sets up a diplomatic track, including appeals to the United Nations. Brazil's position is shaped by proximity and spillover risk. A sustained squeeze on Venezuelan revenue can translate into shortages, migration pressure, and instability that lands on neighbors first. Lula's warning is less about taking sides and more about stopping the situation from tipping into armed confrontation. Scenarios to watch. Controlled pressure, most orderly. Interdictions stay limited and legally framed. Venezuela avoids escorts. Trade slows but does not collapse. Cat-and-mouse escalation. More boardings. More disguising tactics. More near misses at sea. Naval incident. Escorts, warnings, or a miscommunication produces a collision, an exchange of fire, or detentions that force leaders into a hard response. Diplomatic off-ramp. Regional powers broker talks that reduce tempo of interdictions, without either side publicly backing down. Economic and market impact. The choke point is not oil in the ground. It is oil in motion. If ships believe they can be stopped, even when not formally listed as sanctioned, they will hesitate. That hesitation alone can reduce exports, strand cargoes, and widen discounts. It also encourages costly workarounds, longer routes, more ship-to-ship transfers, and more intermediaries. China is a major destination for Venezuelan crude. Recent flows suggest December volumes were running in the hundreds of thousands of barrels per day. Even if the global market is well supplied in the short term, the loss of close to 1 million barrels per day becomes meaningful if it persists. Second-order effect. Once physical interdiction becomes normalized, the market does not just price barrels. It prices legal risk, insurance risk, and the probability of cargo being delayed for weeks. Social and cultural fallout. When oil revenue drops, the effects inside Venezuela can become blunt fast. Fewer imports, weaker public services, and more pressure on households already stretched. That is the pathway to the humanitarian language regional leaders are using. Outside Venezuela, the social impact shows up as border strain, public anxiety in neighboring states, and political arguments over whether pressure is a solution or a trigger. The information environment also hardens. Each side frames the same event as law enforcement or piracy. That increases the odds of miscalculation because domestic audiences are primed to demand toughness. Technological and security implications. Modern sanctions evasion is a logistics and data game. Flags of convenience, name changes, altered paperwork, masked tracking signals, and ship-to-ship transfers. Interdiction flips the game. Instead of trying to detect evasion after the fact, the enforcing side makes the ocean itself a checkpoint. But that creates a security dilemma. If Venezuela responds with more naval escorting, the operating space becomes crowded and tense. The more hardware in the same waters, the less margin there is for a mistake. What most coverage misses. The overlooked bottleneck is not rhetoric. It is legal and operational permission. Stopping a ship on the high seas is not a press release. It typically requires a legal theory that holds up later, and often some form of flag state cooperation or a defensible enforcement basis. If that foundation looks shaky, the policy becomes harder to sustain internationally, even if it works tactically in the short term. The second overlooked point is throughput. You do not need to seize every tanker. You only need enough uncertainty that shipowners, insurers, and buyers start self-deterring. That is why even a small number of interceptions can cause a large fall in exports. Why this matters. Short term, this is about whether Venezuelan oil keeps moving and whether shipping firms believe the rules have changed overnight. Long term, it is about precedent, how far a major power can push maritime enforcement in a politically charged region without triggering regional backlash, legal challenges, or a dangerous incident at sea. Events and signals to watch next include any formal legal documentation released to justify the December 20 boarding, whether Panama publicly confirms or disputes cooperation tied to the vessel's flag, whether Venezuela begins routine naval escorts for outbound shipments, any scheduled discussion at the UN Security Council tied to Venezuela's complaint, whether additional boardings occur in the next 1 to 2 weeks. If you remember one thing, remember this: the real fight is over whether shipping risk becomes the new sanctions. Real-world impact. A shipping compliance manager in Panama reviews a new charter request for Caribbean lifting. The cargo looks clean on paper, but the manager prices in the risk of detention anyway. The voyage still happens, but at a higher cost and with fewer willing partners. A refinery buyer in coastal China wants a discounted, heavy, crude cargo. The economics still work, but delivery timing becomes the problem. The buyer adds alternative barrels and delays maintenance plans because the ship may not arrive on schedule. A border town official in northern Brazil prepares for a new wave of arrivals. Even a modest increase strains shelter capacity and health services. The official's planning horizon shrinks from months to days. Road ahead? A tanker interdiction is a tactical event. A sustained pattern of interdictions is a strategic shift. If the United States keeps stopping ships near Venezuela, exports can fall sharply, even without new sanctions on paper. If Venezuela responds with escorts and confrontation, the risk moves from economics into security. The next signposts are legal clarity, the tempo of further boardings, and whether regional diplomacy slows the escalation before an incident forces everyone's hand.